Chester's boarding announcement echoed through Terminal B as he disappeared with Victoria onto Flight 447 to the Bahamas, leaving me standing at the gate with a canceled ticket and his laughter still ringing in my ears. He thought I'd crawl home devastated and broken. Instead, I pulled out the envelope that would destroy both their lives forever, the one containing proof that Victoria had been embezzling from her own law firm to fund their affair, and Chester had been helping her launder the money. By the time their plane touched down in Paradise, the FBI was already waiting. But my story doesn't begin here. Standing in this bustling airport terminal clutching the most devastating evidence two cheaters could imagine. No, this story starts 6 months earlier, with the biggest real estate deal of my career and a celebration dinner that should have been the happiest night of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember that evening so clearly now, March 15th, sitting across from Chester at Romano's, our favorite Italian restaurant in downtown Phoenix. The candlelight flickered across his handsome face as he raised his wine glass, those warm brown eyes I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago sparkling with what I thought was genuine pride. "To my brilliant wife," he said, his voice carrying that charming southern drawl that had first caught my attention at Arizona State. "The woman who just closed the biggest commercial real estate deal in Phoenix history." I blushed, touching the diamond pendant he'd given me for our anniversary. $68 million, I whispered, still unable to believe it myself. The Henderson Commercial Complex. Dad would have been so proud. Chester's smile faltered for just a moment. So briefly I almost missed it. But then he was leaning across the table, his hand covering mine. "Esther, sweetheart, you've built something incredible. Maxwell and Associates is more than just a real estate firm now, it's an empire." He was right. What had started as my father's small residential real estate office in Scottsdale had grown into the most prestigious commercial real estate firm in Arizona under my leadership. After Dad's sudden heart attack 3 years ago, I'd thrown myself into the business with a determination that surprised everyone, including myself. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, squeezing his hand. And I meant it. Chester had been my rock throughout Dad's illness and death, handling everything from funeral arrangements to helping me navigate the complex transition of taking over the business. When sleepless nights and 18-hour workdays became my norm, he never complained. When I missed dinners because of client emergencies, he'd show up at my office with takeout and massage my shoulders while I worked. "You're going to need help managing all this success," Chester said, his tone carefully casual. "Have you thought about bringing in a partner? Someone who understands both business and law?" I tilted my head, studying his expression. We'd had this conversation before. "Chester, you know I appreciate everything you do for your clients, but real estate law and corporate law are completely different." "I'm not talking about me," he interrupted with a laugh that seemed just a little too forced, "though I appreciate your confidence in my abilities. No, I'm thinking someone with commercial real estate experience, someone like Victoria Blackwood." The name hit me like a splash of cold water. Victoria Blackwood, the stunning redhead who'd recently joined Preston, Hartley and Associates, one of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms. I'd met her briefly at a charity gala last month, where she'd monopolized Chester's attention for what felt like hours, discussing some complex corporate restructuring case. "Victoria's brilliant," Chester continued, either not noticing my sudden tension or choosing to ignore it. "She's handled some of the biggest commercial deals on the West Coast, and she mentioned she's looking for new opportunities in Arizona." "I don't need a partner," I said quietly. "Maxwell and Associates has been family-owned for 30 years. Dad built it with his own hands, and I'm not about to." "Esther." Chester's voice took on that patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "Your father was a great man, but he never dealt with deals of this magnitude. You're playing in a different league now. The Henderson complex is just the beginning. I've heard rumors about the Desert Springs project, and if that comes through..." He was right about Desert Springs. It was a potential $200 million mixed-use development that would make the Henderson deal look small, but something about the way he brought up Victoria made my stomach twist. "How do you know so much about what Victoria's looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Chester's eyes didn't quite meet mine. We've been discussing it, professionally, of course. She reached out after hearing about your Henderson's success. Actually, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I invited her to join us for drinks next Friday. Nothing formal, just a chance for you two to get to know each other. The waiter appeared with our entrees, giving me a moment to process this information. Chester had arranged a meeting with Victoria without asking me first. In the past, he would have checked with me before making any plans, especially ones involving my business. You should have asked me first, I said after the waiter left. You're right, and I apologize. Chester reached for my hand again, his thumb tracing circles on my palm in that soothing way that usually melted my resistance. I was just excited about the opportunity. Victoria could help take Maxwell and Associates to the next level. I wanted to believe him. Chester had always been ambitious, not just for himself, but for us as a couple. His own law practice had grown significantly over the past few years, partly due to referrals from my real estate clients who needed legal representation. We were a team, personally and professionally. Okay, I said finally. One meeting. But Chester, I need you to understand, this is my company. Any decisions about partnerships or major changes go through me. Of course, he said quickly. I would never presume to make those kinds of decisions for you. But even as he said it, something in his expression didn't ring true. Maybe it was the way his eyes shifted slightly to the left, or how his grip on my hand tightened just a fraction. Whatever it was, a small seed of unease planted itself in my chest. The rest of our dinner passed pleasantly enough. Chester told me about his latest case, defending a tech startup against a patent infringement lawsuit, and I shared my excitement about the potential Desert Springs project. By the time we got home to our house in Paradise Valley, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting about Victoria. Almost. That night, as Chester slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about the way he'd said her name. Victoria's brilliant. There had been an admiration in his voice that went beyond professional respect. In the casual way he'd mentioned their discussions about her career prospects, how many conversations had they been having without my knowledge? I rolled over to look at my husband's sleeping face, peaceful in the moonlight streaming through our bedroom windows. Chester Michael Davidson, successful attorney, devoted husband, the man who'd supported me through the darkest period of my life. Surely I was letting stress and paranoia get the better of me. Ms. Maxwell, this is George Wellington from Wellington International Properties in London. I hope I haven't called too early. I calculated the time difference, but I'm afraid I may have gotten it wrong. London. My pulse quickened. Wellington International was one of the most prestigious real estate development firms in Europe, known for billion-dollar projects that reshaped entire city skylines. No, it's fine, I said, suddenly wide awake. What can I do for you, Mr. Wellington? Actually, Ms. Maxwell, it's what I might be able to do for you. We've been following your work quite closely. The Henderson Complex deal was particularly impressive. The way you structured the financing while navigating those zoning challenges showed remarkable sophistication. I felt a flush of pride. International recognition was something I'd dreamed about but never expected so soon. Thank you, I managed. That's very kind. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept echoing in my mind. Why hadn't he told me about Victoria reaching out before tonight? It was such a small thing, really. But sometimes the smallest cracks are the first signs that the foundation is about to crumble. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in April, jarring me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, squinting at the unknown number as Chester stirred beside me. Esther Maxwell? The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. Speaking? I mumbled, sliding out of bed and padding to the kitchen so I wouldn't wake Chester. Ms. Maxwell, this is George Wellington from Wellington International Properties in London. I hope I haven't called too early. I calculated the time difference, but I'm afraid I may have gotten it wrong. London. My pulse quickened. Wellington International was one of the most prestigious real estate development firms in Europe, known for billion-dollar projects that reshaped entire city skylines. No, it's fine, I said, suddenly wide awake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What can I do for you, Mr. Wellington? Actually, Ms. Maxwell, it's what I might be able to do for you. We've been following your work quite closely. The Henderson Complex deal was particularly impressive. The way you structured the financing while navigating those zoning challenges showed remarkable sophistication. I felt a flush of pride. International recognition was something I dreamed about but never expected so soon. Thank you, I managed. That's very kind. Ms. Maxwell, I'll cut straight to the point. Wellington International is expanding into the American market, specifically the Southwest. We're looking for a local partner, someone who understands the market dynamics but has the vision to think globally. After extensive research, your name keeps coming to the top of our list. I gripped the phone tighter, my heart hammering. What exactly are you proposing? A joint venture for the Desert Springs project. The words hit me like lightning. Desert Springs. The massive mixed-use development I'd been pursuing for months, the one Chester had mentioned at dinner. It was the holy grail of Phoenix real estate, a $200 million project that would include luxury condos, high-end retail, office space, and a boutique hotel. I'm listening, I said carefully. We have the capital, $150 million in immediate funding. You have the local expertise and government relationships. Together, we could not only secure Desert Springs, but expand throughout Arizona and Nevada. This could be a $500 million partnership within 2 years. $500 million. The number was almost incomprehensible. Maxwell & Associates was successful, but this would catapult us into an entirely different stratosphere. Mr. Wellington, this sounds incredible, but I have to ask, why me? There are larger firms with more resources. His laugh was warm, genuine. Ms. Maxwell, we're not interested in larger firms. We're interested in hungry, innovative partners who aren't set in their ways. Your work speaks for itself. You've increased your company's revenue by 340% in 3 years, all while maintaining a perfect client satisfaction record. That's not luck. That's extraordinary business acumen. I felt dizzy. 340%. I'd never calculated it quite that way, but he was right. There is one condition, Wellington continued. We move fast. Very fast. The Desert Springs developers are making their final decision next month. If we're going to do this, we need to present a united front immediately. I'll be flying to Phoenix Thursday. Can you clear your schedule for a full-day meeting? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. Excellent. I'll have my assistant send over the preliminary proposals. Ms. Maxwell, I have a feeling this is the beginning of something extraordinary. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. In one phone call, my entire future had shifted. This wasn't just about money. This was about building a legacy that would dwarf anything my father had imagined. Who was that? Chester's voice made me jump. He stood in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, concern creasing his features. George Wellington, I said, still in a daze. From Wellington International Properties in London. Chester's eyebrows shot up. The Wellington family? The ones who developed half of central London? The same. Chester? They want to partner with us on Desert Springs. They're talking about a $500 million joint venture. For a moment, Chester just stared at me. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and swept me into his arms, spinning me around until I laughed. Esther, this is incredible. Do you realize what this means? He set me down, his hands gripping my shoulders. This isn't just about Maxwell and Associates anymore. This is about building an empire. The word empire sent a thrill through me. George is flying in Thursday for meetings. I'll need to prepare everything. Financial statements, project portfolios, legal documentation. I can help with the legal side, Chester offered immediately. Contract review, corporate structuring. Actually, I said slowly, I think I'll need to bring in a specialist. International joint ventures are complex, and George mentioned they move very fast. I can't afford any mistakes. Something flickered across Chester's face. Disappointment, maybe, or something harder to identify. Of course. You're right. This is too important to risk. But even as he said it, I could sense his frustration. Chester was brilliant, but his expertise was in criminal defense and small business law. This deal would require corporate attorneys who specialized in international transactions and multi-million-dollar developments. I'll still need your support, I assured him. Just maybe, not in the legal capacity. Whatever you need, he said, pulling me close. I'm so proud of you, Esther. Your dad would be over the moon. As Chester held me, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what Dad would say. He'd built Maxwell & Associates from nothing, working 18-hour days and sacrificing vacations to establish our reputation. But even in his wildest dreams, he'd never envisioned something like this. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation. I pulled together 3 years of financial records, compiled portfolios of our major projects, and reached out to Margaret Chen, a corporate attorney I'd met at a real estate law conference, who specialized in international deals. Chester threw himself into helping with research, staying up late to compile information about Wellington International's previous projects and George Wellington's background. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. A supportive husband helping his wife prepare for the opportunity of a lifetime. But I began to notice small things that hadn't been there before. The way Chester's jaw tightened when I mentioned bringing in Margaret Chen. How he lingered near my office door when I was on conference calls with potential investors. The casual questions about timeline and financial details that seemed to go beyond simple curiosity. Wednesday evening, as I was reviewing Wellington International's proposal for the 100th time, Chester appeared in my home office doorway with a glass of wine. "You've been working for 12 hours straight," he said, setting the glass on my desk. "Take a break." I accepted the wine gratefully, realizing I hadn't eaten since breakfast. "This proposal is incredible, Chester. George isn't just talking about Desert Springs. He's outlined expansion into Las Vegas, Denver, even international projects." "It's a lot to take in," Chester agreed, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Are you sure you're ready for something this big? The pressure, the travel, the responsibility?" There was something in his tone that made me look up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Nothing negative," he said quickly. "I just want to make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle. International partnerships can be complicated. Different cultures, different business practices. Chester, this is the chance of a lifetime. Wellington International has an impeccable reputation, and George has been nothing but professional." I know. Chester held up his hands. "I'm just saying, maybe you should consider bringing in a co-manager, someone who could share the load." And there it was again, that subtle suggestion that I needed help, that this opportunity might be too big for me to handle alone. The same tone he'd used when suggesting Victoria as a partner. "I can handle it," I said firmly. Chester nodded, but something in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As he left my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that my husband, the man who should be my biggest supporter, was already doubting my ability to succeed. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant Arizona sunshine that made everything seem possible. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, smoothing the lapels of my navy Armani suit, the one I'd bought for closing the Henderson deal, and tried to calm the butterflies in my stomach. "You look perfect," Chester said from behind me, his reflection appearing in the mirror as he adjusted his own tie. "George Wellington is going to be impressed." I turned to face him, noting how handsome he looked in his charcoal gray suit. After 8 years of marriage, Chester still had the ability to make my heart skip a beat. His athletic build, inherited from his college football days at ASU, filled out his clothes perfectly, and those warm brown eyes that had first caught my attention in Professor Martinez's constitutional law class still made me feel like the luckiest woman in Phoenix. "I can't believe this is actually happening," I admitted, reaching for the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my college graduation. 6 months ago, Maxwell & Associates was just a successful local firm. Now we're talking about international partnerships worth $500 million. Chester stepped closer, his hands settling on my shoulders. "Your father would be so proud, Esther. Everything he built, everything he sacrificed for, you're taking it to levels he never could have imagined." The mention of Dad sent a familiar pang through my chest. 3 years since his heart attack, and I still sometimes reach for the phone to call him with good news. He'd been my business mentor, my biggest cheerleader, and the one person who'd always believed I could accomplish anything. I just hope I don't mess this up, I said quietly. Hey. Chester tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his eyes. You're Esther Maxwell. You don't mess things up, you make them better. His confidence in me was unwavering, just as it had been throughout our entire relationship. When I doubted whether I could handle taking over the company after Dad's death, Chester had spent countless nights reassuring me, helping me prepare for meetings, even learning real estate terminology so he could be a better sounding board for my ideas. "What time is your meeting?" he asked, straightening my collar with the kind of attention to detail that made him such a good attorney. "George's flight lands at 10, and we're meeting at the office at noon. Margaret Chen will be there for the legal review, and I've arranged for lunch to be catered from Antonio's. George mentioned he loves Italian food." "Perfect. And tonight?" I smiled. "Tonight, if things go well, we celebrate. I made reservations at the Phoenician, the terrace overlooking Camelback Mountain." Chester's eyes lit up. The Phoenician was where he'd proposed 5 years ago, kneeling beside the infinity pool as the sunset painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. It was our special place reserved for life's biggest moments. "I love you, Mrs. Davidson," he said, using the name I'd taken after our wedding but rarely used professionally. "I love you too," I replied, meaning it completely. The drive to my office in Scottsdale's business district was filled with comfortable conversation about the day ahead. Chester had cleared his morning schedule to see me off, something he'd been doing more often since the Wellington opportunity arose. His attention to my success felt like a gift after months of him being distracted by his own growing caseload. "I'll pick you up at 6, he said as he dropped me off at the Maxwell and Associates building. "We can go home so you can change for dinner." "Actually," I said, gathering my briefcase and portfolio, "why don't you meet me here at 6:30? I want to show George the office, introduce him to the team. This partnership could mean hiring a dozen new people." Something flickered across Chester's face, too quick for me to identify. "Of course, I'll see you then." He leaned across the center console to kiss me, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. My husband supporting my dreams, a potentially life-changing business opportunity ahead, and the promise of celebration that evening. George Wellington turned out to be everything I'd hoped for and more. In his early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of refined British accent that made even casual conversation sound elegant, he exuded the confidence of someone who'd built an empire through vision and careful calculation. "Ms. Maxwell," he said, shaking my hand in the lobby of my building, "it's an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person." Margaret Chen had arrived 30 minutes early, giving us time to review the preliminary documents George's team had sent over. Her assessment was overwhelmingly positive. Wellington International's financial backing was solid, their reputation impeccable, and the proposed partnership structure was remarkably fair. "This is rare," Margaret had told me privately. "Usually international firms want controlling interest when they partner with smaller American companies. Wellington is offering true collaboration." The meeting exceeded every expectation. George's vision for Desert Springs was sophisticated and ambitious, a mixed-use development that would set new standards for sustainable luxury in the Southwest. More importantly, his plans for expansion throughout Arizona and Nevada were concrete, backed by detailed market analysis and financial projections that made my head spin. "The American Southwest is poised for unprecedented growth," George explained, spreading architectural renderings across my conference table. "Climate refugees from both coasts, tech companies relocating from California, retirees seeking luxury in affordable markets. The demographic shifts are creating opportunities that won't exist 5 years from now." By 4 o'clock, we'd outlined the basic partnership structure. Wellington International would provide $150 million in capital, while Maxwell and Associates would handle local permitting, government relations, and day-to-day project management. Profits would be split 60-40, with the larger share going to Wellington due to their financial investment. "There is one element we haven't discussed," George said as Margaret packed up her files. "The leadership structure." I looked up from the financial projections I'd been reviewing. "What do you mean?" "A partnership of this magnitude requires dedicated leadership. Someone who can focus exclusively on our joint ventures without the distraction of managing existing business operations. George's expression remained friendly, but I sensed we were approaching something important. I'd like to propose that you establish a separate entity, Maxwell Wellington Development, with yourself as CEO. The implications hit me immediately. A separate company meant stepping back from the day-to-day operations of Maxwell and Associates, the firm my father had built from nothing. Mr. Wellington, I appreciate the confidence, but Maxwell and Associates is my family's legacy. I'm not suggesting you abandon it, George interrupted gently. Rather, promote someone to manage daily operations while you focus on the bigger picture. Think of it as evolution, not replacement. Margaret leaned forward. It's actually a smart structure from a liability perspective. Separate entities protect both companies if something unexpected happens. I felt a momentary panic. Giving up control of Maxwell and Associates, even partially, felt like betraying Dad's memory. But George was right. Managing a $500 million partnership while running a traditional real estate firm would be impossible. Who would I promote? I asked slowly. That's entirely your decision, George said. Though I imagine you have trusted associates who could handle the responsibility. As we wrapped up the meeting, I found myself thinking about my team. Elsie Rodriguez, my operations manager, was brilliant but preferred working behind the scenes. Tanner Walsh, my top sales agent, was charismatic but lacked management experience. There was really only one person with both the knowledge and leadership skills to run Maxwell and Associates in my absence. But that person wasn't an employee. It was Chester. The thought both excited and terrified me. Chester understood the business, had connections throughout Phoenix's legal community, and had always dreamed of expanding beyond his solo practice. Promoting him to run Maxwell and Associates while I built something new with Wellington International could be the perfect solution. By the time Chester arrived at 6:30, I was practically vibrating with excitement about the possibility. "How did it go?" he asked, finding me in my office as I gathered my things for dinner. "Better than I dreamed," I said, standing to kiss him. "Chester, this partnership is going to change everything. But there's something I want to discuss with you." As we walked to his car, I outlined George's proposal for Maxwell Wellington Development and the need for someone to manage Maxwell and Associates' daily operations. "I want that person to be you," I said as we pulled out of the parking garage. Chester's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Esther, that's incredible. You'd trust me with your father's company?" "Our company," I corrected. "And yes, absolutely. You know the business as well as anyone. You have the legal expertise to handle complex transactions, and I trust you completely." For several blocks, Chester didn't respond, seemingly processing the magnitude of what I was offering. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I won't let you down," he promised. "Maxwell and Associates will be in better shape than ever when you're ready to return full-time." As we pulled into the Phoenician's valet area, I felt a deep satisfaction settle over me. Everything was falling into place: the Wellington partnership, Chester's new role, our future together, brighter than I'd ever imagined. Looking back now, I realized that was the last moment I was completely, naively happy. Because while I was planning our bright future, Chester was already planning my downfall. The paperwork sat on my desk like a loaded gun, waiting to change everything. 3 weeks had passed since my dinner with George Wellington, and the partnership agreements for Maxwell Wellington Development had arrived that morning via express courier from London. Margaret Chen had spent 2 days reviewing every clause, every subcondition, every financial projection. "It's bulletproof," she'd told me over the phone an hour earlier. "George Wellington's team clearly knows what they're doing. The liability protections are exceptional. The profit-sharing structure is more than fair, and the expansion clauses give you incredible growth potential." Now I sat in my office, staring at the signature pages that would transform my life. Chester was across the hall in what had once been our conference room, officially taking over as interim CEO of Maxwell and Associates, while I focused on the new venture. The transition had been smoother than I'd dared hope. "Knock, knock." Chester's voice came from my doorway. He held 2 cups of coffee from the cafe down the street, my usual vanilla latte, and his black coffee with 2 sugars. "Thought you might need some caffeine courage." I accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma. I can't believe I'm actually doing this. Having second thoughts? Chester settled into the chair across from my desk, the same spot where he'd sat hundreds of times over the years when we discussed difficult cases or challenging clients. Not second thoughts, exactly. More like overwhelm. This morning, I was the owner of a successful regional real estate firm. Tonight, I'll be the CEO of an international development company with projects in 3 states. Chester leaned forward, his expression serious. Esther, what you're about to sign represents everything your father dreamed of and more. He would be so proud. The mention of Dad sent the familiar pang through my chest. I touched the framed photo on my desk. Dad and me at the grand opening of our Scottsdale office 5 years ago, both of us grinning beside the new Maxwell & Associates sign. I just hope I'm making the right choice about Maxwell & Associates, I said quietly. Putting you in charge permanently feels like such a huge decision. Not permanently, Chester corrected gently. We discussed this. I'm taking over daily operations so you can focus on Maxwell Wellington development. When you're ready to step back into both roles, we'll figure it out together. But that wasn't entirely true. The documents spread across my desk included more than just the Wellington Partnership Agreement. Hidden among the corporate restructuring papers was another set of documents Margaret had drafted at my request, papers that would make Chester an equal partner in Maxwell & Associates. I hadn't told him yet. The idea had come to me during one of our late-night planning sessions. Chester had been working 18-hour days to understand every aspect of the real estate business, learning our client management systems, memorizing property portfolios, even studying architectural plans so he could speak intelligently with contractors and developers. His dedication was absolute. More than that, his suggestions had been brilliant. He'd identified inefficiencies in our contract approval process that could save thousands of dollars per deal. He'd proposed a client retention program that had already resulted in 3 major referrals. In 3 weeks, he'd proven himself more valuable than some employees I'd had for years. There's something else I want to discuss, I said, pulling out the second set of documents. Something I've been thinking about since you started working here. Chester raised an eyebrow, setting down his coffee cup. Sounds serious. It is. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what I was about to offer. Chester, you've transformed this company in 3 weeks. Your legal expertise has already saved us money, your business insights have improved our processes, and our staff genuinely respects your leadership. Thank you, he said carefully, clearly sensing there was more coming. I want to make you an equal partner in Maxwell & Associates, not just interim CEO, but co-owner. 50-50 split of all assets, profits, and decision-making authority. The words hung in the air between us. Chester's expression shifted from surprise to disbelief to something deeper, an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Esther, he said slowly, are you sure about this? Your father built this company from nothing. It's your legacy. Our legacy, I corrected. Chester, we're married. Your success is my success, and vice versa. Besides, you've earned this. The work you've put in, the results you've achieved, you're not just helping me manage Dad's company anymore. You're making it better. Chester stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Scottsdale's business district. His reflection in the glass showed a man wrestling with something significant. This is incredible, Esther. I never expected, I knew you trusted me to run operations, but actual ownership. You deserve it, I said firmly. And honestly, it makes practical sense. With me focusing on Maxwell Wellington development, Maxwell & Associates needs someone who's fully invested in its success, someone who has skin in the game. He turned back to face me, his eyes bright with what looked like unshed tears. You're giving me everything I've ever wanted professionally. I'm giving us everything we've ever wanted, I corrected. Think about it. In 5 years, you'll be running a multi-million-dollar real estate firm while I'm expanding internationally with Wellington. We'll be the most powerful couple in Phoenix real estate. Chester crossed back to my desk and picked up the partnership documents, scanning the terms Margaret had outlined. Equal ownership, equal authority, equal profit distribution. It was the most generous offer I'd ever made to anyone. Tras pitain. The only condition, I added, is that we're partners in every sense. No major decisions without discussing them together. No changes to company structure or personnel without mutual agreement. We're a team. Of course, Chester said immediately. I would never make unilateral decisions about something this important. The sincerity in his voice convinced me completely. This was my husband, the man who'd supported me through Dad's death and the stress of taking over the company. The man who'd celebrated my successes and comforted me through my failures. If I couldn't trust Chester with my father's legacy, who could I trust? Then let's make it official, I said, pulling out a pen. The next hour was a blur of signatures, notarizations, and legal formalities. Margaret Chen arrived to witness the partnership agreement, bringing her notary seal and a bottle of champagne to celebrate. By 6 o'clock, Chester Michael Davidson was officially co-owner of Maxwell and Associates. To new beginnings, Chester said, raising his champagne flute as the three of us stood in my office. To partnerships, I replied, clinking my glass against his. To trust, Margaret added with a smile. As we drank, I felt a deep satisfaction settle over me. Everything was falling into place perfectly. The Wellington partnership would allow me to build something revolutionary, while Chester would ensure Dad's original company continued to thrive. Our marriage was stronger than ever, built on mutual respect and shared ambition. Chester suggested we celebrate with dinner at Romano's, the same restaurant where this all began, with his suggestion about Victoria Blackwood. The irony wasn't lost on me. That conversation had sparked my first doubts about his motivations, but tonight those doubts seemed foolish. Here was my husband, overwhelmed with gratitude for the opportunity I'd given him, already making plans to honor Dad's memory while building something even greater. I have an idea, Chester said as we walked to his car. What if we threw a party? A celebration of both partnerships, yours with Wellington and ours with Maxwell and Associates. We could invite the whole team, some of our biggest clients, maybe some of your father's old friends. That sounds perfect, I agreed. A way to officially introduce you as co-owner and announce the Wellington venture. Exactly. And Esther? Chester stopped walking and took my hands. Thank you. For trusting me with this. For believing in me. I promise I'll spend every day proving I deserve it. Standing there in the warm Arizona evening, my husband's hands warm in mine, I believed him completely. Chester had never broken a promise to me. He'd never given me reason to doubt his loyalty or his love. The paperwork in my briefcase represented the culmination of everything we'd built together. 2 successful businesses, a strong marriage, and a shared future that seemed limitless. I had no way of knowing that within 6 months, those same documents would become the weapons he'd use to destroy me. That the partnership I'd offered out of love and trust would be the very tool he needed to steal everything my father had built. But that night, walking toward Romano's with my husband and business partner, I was the happiest woman in Phoenix. And Chester was already planning how to take it all away from me. The changes started small, so subtle, I almost missed them entirely. It began with Chester's new office, the corner space that had been Dad's, which I'd offered him as co-owner of Maxwell and Associates. I'd expected him to ask before redecorating, but I came in one Monday morning to find workmen installing a massive mahogany desk and leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Surprise, Chester said, appearing beside me as I stood in the doorway. I wanted to create a space that reflected our new partnership. Professional, authoritative. The office looked impressive, but it bore no resemblance to Dad's warm, approachable workspace with its family photos and Arizona state memorabilia. This felt like a corporate law firm, cold and intimidating. It's very nice, I said carefully, though you might have mentioned the renovation. That desk alone must have cost $15,000. 18, actually, Chester replied without a hint of embarrassment. But Esther, we're playing in bigger leagues now. When George Wellington visits, or when we meet with major investors, we need to look the part. Image is everything in business. I wanted to argue that Dad had built Maxwell and Associates' reputation on results, not expensive furniture, but Chester was already ushering me toward the conference room where he'd scheduled our Monday morning meeting. "I've prepared some updates on our Q2 performance," he said, spreading out charts and graphs across the table. "The numbers are excellent, but I've identified several areas where we can improve efficiency." The presentation was impressive, I had to admit. Chester had analyzed every aspect of our operations, from client acquisition costs to employee productivity metrics. His recommendations were logical, backed by data, and would likely save us significant money. "This is thorough," I said, reviewing his proposal to restructure our commission structure, though I'm concerned about reducing our agents' percentages. "Tanner Walsh and Alex Morrison have been with us for years." "Exactly the problem," Chester replied smoothly. "They've gotten comfortable, complacent. Market analysis shows we're paying above-average commissions while getting average results. If we want to attract top talent, we need to reward performance, not tenure." It made business sense, but something about his tone bothered me. Tanner and Alex weren't just employees. They were part of our family. Dad had hired them both, straight out of college, mentored them, celebrated their successes. Reducing their commissions felt like a betrayal of that relationship. "I'd like to think about it," I said. "Maybe we could grandfather existing agents into the old structure while implementing the new rates for future hires." Chester's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Esther, we can't run a business on sentiment. Either we're committed to maximizing profitability or we're not." The word sentiment stung. Was honoring Dad's relationships with longtime employees really just sentiment? Over the following weeks, Chester's influence expanded throughout the company in ways both obvious and subtle. He hired a new assistant, a striking blonde named Gigi Patterson who'd worked at a Fortune 500 company in Los Angeles, without consulting me first. When I questioned the decision, he explained that his increased responsibilities required professional administrative support. "Elsie Rodriguez handles your calendar and correspondence perfectly," I pointed out. "We could have just expanded her role." "Elsie's wonderful," Chester agreed, "but she lacks the sophistication we need for international clients. Gigi has experience with high-level corporate communications, event planning, complex travel arrangements. Trust me, the investment will pay for itself." Gigi was certainly professional, I had to admit. She spoke 3 languages, dressed impeccably, and handled Chester's increasingly complicated schedule with remarkable efficiency. But something about her presence made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was how she seemed to know Chester's preferences better than I did after just 2 weeks, or how she lingered in his office for lengthy discussions about matters that seemed routine. The bigger concern was how Chester's decision-making process had evolved. Decisions that once required mutual agreement were now presented to me as fait accompli. New marketing materials featuring Chester prominently alongside the Maxwell and Associates logo. A company credit card with a $50,000 limit that he'd obtained for business emergencies. Software upgrades and system changes that affected how we tracked client relationships and financial data. "I'm not trying to exclude you," Chester explained when I finally confronted him about the pattern. "But you're busy with Maxwell Wellington development, traveling constantly for the Desert Springs project. Someone needs to keep Maxwell and Associates moving forward." He wasn't wrong about my schedule. The Wellington partnership had demanded more time than I'd anticipated. Site visits, permit meetings, architectural reviews, and endless conference calls with George's team in London. Some weeks I barely spent 2 days in the Maxwell and Associates office. But that didn't explain why Chester had hired 2 new agents without posting the positions internally, or why he'd renegotiated our lease agreement with terms I'd never seen. When I asked Elsie about these changes, she looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Davidson handles most of the operational decisions now," she said carefully. "He says you're too busy with the international project to be bothered with routine matters." Routine matters. When had hiring new staff and restructuring lease agreements become routine matters that didn't require my input? The most troubling change was how Chester interacted with our clients. I began hearing secondhand that he was positioning himself as the primary contact for major accounts, suggesting that my Wellington commitments made me less available for their needs. When longtime client Robert Harrison called to congratulate me on the Desert Springs announcement, he mentioned that Chester had assured him I'd be, quote, transitioning away from day-to-day client relationships. "Transitioning away?" I repeated. Robert, I'm not going anywhere. The Wellington partnership is separate from Maxwell and Associates. Oh, Robert said, sounding confused. Chester made it sound like you were stepping back to focus on the international work. He offered to handle all our future transactions personally. That evening, I confronted Chester at home. We were in our kitchen, preparing dinner together, as we'd done hundreds of times before, but the atmosphere felt different. Charged with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. I talked to Robert Harrison today, I said, slicing vegetables with more force than necessary. He seems to think I'm leaving Maxwell and Associates. Chester paused in his task of seasoning the chicken. I may have mentioned that your Wellington commitments were becoming more demanding. I didn't want him to feel neglected if you weren't available for meetings. But I am available. I've made it clear that Maxwell and Associates remains my priority. Esther, be realistic. Chester's tone took on that patient quality he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. The Desert Springs project alone requires you to be in meetings 3 days a week. The Las Vegas expansion George mentioned will demand even more travel. You can't be CEO of an international development company and maintain personal relationships with local real estate clients. I can if I want to, I said firmly. And I should be involved in decisions about how we manage that transition, not hear about it secondhand from clients. Chester set down the seasoning and turned to face me fully. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying that somewhere along the way you've started making unilateral decisions about a company we're supposed to be running together. The new hires, the lease renegotiation, the client communications. When did we stop being partners and start being boss and subordinate? For a moment, something flickered in Chester's eyes. Something that looked almost like annoyance before his expressions softened into concern. You're absolutely right, he said, moving closer and placing his hands on my shoulders. I've been overeager trying to prove myself worthy of the partnership you gave me. I never meant to overstep. The apology felt genuine, and I wanted to believe it. Chester had always been ambitious, driven to succeed. Maybe I was overreacting to normal growing pains as we adjusted to our new roles. I just want us to be a team, I said, like we promised. We are a team, Chester assured me, pulling me into his arms. The best team Phoenix has ever seen. From now on, all major decisions get discussed together. No more surprises. As Chester held me in our kitchen, I felt the tension of the past weeks begin to dissipate. We were partners, in business and in life. These were just adjustments, as we navigated new territory together. But that night, as Chester slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about Gigi Patterson's knowing smile and Robert Harrison's confusion about my role in the company. Something fundamental was shifting in the dynamics of Maxwell and Associates, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Chester's promise of partnership was becoming increasingly hollow. The changes were subtle, gradual, like a tide slowly eroding a shoreline. By the time I recognized the damage, it might be too late to save what my father had built. The first concrete evidence something was wrong came on a Thursday afternoon in late June. I'd returned early from a site meeting with the Desert Springs architects, hoping to surprise Chester with lunch from his favorite deli. Instead, I found his office door closed and heard muffled voices inside, Chester's deep baritone and a woman's laughter that definitely wasn't Elsie's. I knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege I'd assumed as co-owner of the company. Chester and Victoria Blackwood were seated on his leather sofa, papers spread across the coffee table between them, but something about their body language made me pause. They weren't just close, they were intimate, leaning toward each other in a way that spoke of familiarity beyond professional interaction. Esther! Chester stood quickly, his smile just a fraction too bright. I didn't expect you back so early. Victoria rose more slowly, smoothing her red dress with manicured fingers. She was even more stunning than I remembered from the charity gala, tall, elegant, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she commanded attention wherever she went. Mrs. Davidson, Victoria said with a perfect smile. What a pleasant surprise. Chester was just showing me the Henderson Complex portfolio. Truly impressive work. Thank you, I replied, my voice steady despite the unease crawling up my spine. I thought you were working with Preston, Hartley, and Associates. I was, Victoria said smoothly. But opportunities change, don't they? Chester mentioned you might need additional legal counsel for the international expansion. I looked at Chester, who was gathering the papers from the coffee table with unnecessary haste. We haven't discussed bringing in additional counsel. It was preliminary, Chester said quickly. Just exploring options. Victoria specializes in international real estate law, and with the Wellington partnership expanding so rapidly. I see. I set the lunch bag on Chester's desk, suddenly no longer hungry. Victoria, I hate to cut this short, but Chester and I have a partners meeting scheduled. It was a lie, but Victoria took the hint gracefully. Of course. Chester has my contact information when you're ready to discuss the legal structure in more detail. She gathered her purse and briefcase, pausing to touch Chester's arm in a gesture that lasted a beat too long. Thank you for the consultation. I look forward to working together. After Victoria left, an uncomfortable silence settled over Chester's office. He busied himself organizing papers while I studied his face, looking for signs of the man I'd married. How long has this been going on? I asked finally. What do you mean? Chester's tone was carefully neutral. The meetings with Victoria, the legal consultations I apparently knew nothing about. Chester sighed, settling into his desk chair. Esther, you've been so busy with Wellington projects that I wasn't sure when we'd have time to discuss it properly. Victoria reached out last week about potential collaboration. She reached out to you? Not to me, the CEO of Maxwell Wellington Development? She knows me from the legal community. It made sense for her to start with an initial conversation before we brought you in. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about Chester's demeanor felt off. The way he avoided direct eye contact, how his fingers drummed against his desk, tells I'd learned to recognize during our years together. What kind of collaboration are we discussing exactly? Chester pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. Victoria's firm has handled 3 major international real estate ventures in the past 2 years. Her expertise could be invaluable as we expand beyond Arizona. The portfolio was impressive, I had to admit. Victoria had negotiated complex deals in London, Dubai, and Singapore. Exactly the kind of experience that could benefit Maxwell Wellington Development. But something nagged at me about the timing and the secrecy surrounding their discussions. I'd like to review her qualifications before we make any decisions, I said. And in the future, please include me in preliminary discussions about company business. Of course, Chester agreed too quickly. I should have mentioned it sooner. Over the following days, I found myself paying closer attention to Chester's schedule and behavior. He was taking longer lunches, staying late for client meetings that weren't on our shared calendar, and receiving phone calls that he took privately rather than through Gigi or Elsie. When I asked Gigi about Chester's afternoon appointments, she seemed flustered. Mr. Davidson handles his personal calendar separately, she said. He asked me to focus on Maxwell and Associates business only. Personal calendar? Since when did Chester maintain a separate schedule for business meetings? The real revelation came the following Tuesday when I was reviewing our company credit card statements. Among the usual office supplies and client entertainment charges was a series of expenses that made my blood run cold. Expensive lunches at upscale restaurants, charges at high-end hotels during times when Chester had claimed to be in Phoenix, and, most troubling, a payment to Morrison's jewelry for $3,200. I stared at the jewelry charge, my hands trembling slightly. Chester hadn't given me anything from Morrison's recently. Our anniversary wasn't until September, and my birthday had passed months ago without any significant gifts. Elsie, I called, my voice carefully controlled. Could you come in here for a moment? Elsie appeared in my doorway, her expression concerned. She'd been Dad's assistant for 15 years before becoming mine, and she could read my moods better than almost anyone. Everything okay, Mrs. Davidson? I'm reviewing these credit card charges, I said, turning my computer screen toward her. Do you know anything about this jewelry purchase? Elsie's face went pale as she looked at the screen. No, ma'am. I don't handle Mr. Davidson's personal purchases. But this was charged to the company card, the one intended for business expenses. Maybe it was a client gift? Elsie suggested weakly, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it herself. That evening, I confronted Chester at home. We were in our living room, he with a glass of wine and a stack of legal briefs, me with the credit card statement clutched in my hand. I need to ask you about some charges on the company card, I said, sitting across from him. Chester looked up from his reading, his expression neutral. What kind of charges? $3,000 at Morrison's Jewelry. Last Thursday afternoon. For just a moment, Chester's composure slipped. I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation, before he recovered. That was a client appreciation gift, he said smoothly. The Hartmans closed on their commercial property, and Linda mentioned she'd been admiring a necklace at Morrison's. I thought it would be a nice gesture. The lie was so polished, so detailed, that I almost believed it. But Linda Hartman was in her 70s and wore simple costume jewelry exclusively. The idea of her admiring an expensive necklace worth thousands of dollars was absurd. That seems like an unusually expensive gift for a client, I said carefully. The Hartman deal brought us a $40,000 commission, Chester replied. A $3,000 gesture of appreciation is good business. I wanted to believe him. Desperately wanted to accept his explanation and return to the comfortable dynamic we'd shared for 8 years. But the evidence was mounting. The secret meetings with Victoria, the mysterious schedule changes, and now expensive jewelry purchased during a time when he'd claimed to be working. Chester, I said quietly, is there something you want to tell me? He set down his wine glass and met my eyes directly. Esther, I love you. I've loved you since law school, and I love you now. Whatever doubts you're having, whatever concerns, they're unfounded. The sincerity in his voice was so convincing that for a moment I questioned my own suspicions. This was Chester, the man who'd held me through Dad's funeral, who'd supported my dreams and celebrated my successes. Surely I was letting stress and paranoia cloud my judgment. But as I looked into his familiar brown eyes, I realized something had changed. The warmth that had once made me feel safe and cherished had been replaced by something cooler, more calculating. Chester was still telling me he loved me, but I no longer felt loved. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a courier who insisted I sign for it personally. My name was typed across the front in block letters, Mrs. Esther Davidson, personal and confidential. No return address, no company logo, just plain manila paper that felt heavy in my hands. I waited until I was alone in my office before opening it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and my world tilted on its axis. Chester and Victoria at Romano's, the restaurant where we'd celebrated our engagement. Chester and Victoria entering the Ritz-Carlton downtown, his hand possessive on her lower back. Chester and Victoria kissing passionately outside what looked like a private residence, her red hair brilliant in the sunlight. But it was the final photograph that made my stomach drop. Chester and Victoria, in what was clearly a hotel room, both partially undressed, Victoria wearing a necklace that sparkled even in the dim lighting. A necklace that looked suspiciously like something worth $3,200 from Morrison's Jewelry. My hands shook as I spread the photos across my desk like pieces of a puzzle I desperately hoped would never come together. Each image was time-stamped, showing a relationship that had been developing for weeks, maybe months. The most recent was dated just 3 days ago, Tuesday afternoon, when Chester had claimed to be meeting with potential clients. A single typed note accompanied the photographs. Thought you should know what your business partner has been doing with your company credit card. A concerned friend. I sat in my office chair, staring at the evidence of my husband's betrayal, and felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, that had been cracking for weeks as I'd noticed the changes in Chester's behavior. What broke was my ability to pretend, to rationalize, to hope that my suspicions were unfounded. The intercom buzzed, startling me from my shock. Mrs. Davidson? Elsie's voice sounded tinny through the speaker. Your 10 a.m. appointment is here. I looked at my watch, 9:58 a.m. Somehow I'd lost 20 minutes staring at the photographs, trying to process the magnitude of Chester's deception. Give me 5 minutes, I managed, my voice surprisingly steady, then send them in. I swept the photographs into the envelope and locked it in my desk drawer. Whatever meeting I had scheduled would have to proceed as normal. I couldn't afford to fall apart, not when so much depended on my professional reputation. But concentration proved impossible. Throughout the morning, as I met with architects about Desert Springs and reviewed contract proposals with George Wellington's team via video conference, the photographs burned in my mind. Every smile Chester had given me, every reassurance about our partnership, every promise about our future, all of it felt like elaborate lies designed to keep me compliant while he systematically betrayed me. During lunch, I called Margaret Chen. "I need to see you," I said without preamble. "Today, if possible. And Margaret, I need complete confidentiality." "Of course," Margaret replied, her tone immediately serious. "Is this about the Wellington partnership?" "No," I said quietly. "It's about my marriage." 2 hours later, I sat in Margaret's downtown office, the envelope of photographs on the table between us. Margaret had reviewed each image with the clinical detachment of a lawyer gathering evidence, but I could see the sympathy in her eyes. "How long have you suspected?" she asked finally. "Weeks," I admitted. "Maybe months, if I'm being honest." There were signs, changes in his behavior, unexplained expenses, secretive meetings, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Margaret nodded. Denial is a natural response, especially when the betrayal comes from someone you trust completely. She gestured toward the photographs. "Have you confronted him about any of this?" "Not directly. I asked about some suspicious charges on the company credit card, and he had explanations for everything. Very convincing explanations." "That's typical," Margaret said. "Cheating spouses often become expert liars by necessity. The question is, what do you want to do now?" I stared out Margaret's office window at the Phoenix skyline, trying to organize my thoughts. "I don't know. Part of me wants to confront him immediately, demand the truth, but another part of me thinks I should gather more evidence first." "Both instincts are understandable," Margaret said carefully. "But Esther, there's something else we need to discuss. Your business interests." The words hit me like cold water. In my shock over the affair, I'd forgotten about the most devastating implication. Chester was my equal partner in Maxwell & Associates. He had access to all our accounts, all our contracts, all our client relationships. "If you're considering divorce," Margaret continued, "we need to protect your business assets immediately. Chester's betrayal of your marriage may also extend to financial impropriety." "You think he's stealing from the company?" "I think a man willing to charge his mistress's jewelry to the company credit card is capable of other financial deceptions. We should conduct a forensic audit of all accounts and transactions." The suggestion made sense, but it also felt like admitting defeat. Once I started investigating Chester's business activities, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that we were partners working toward a shared future. "How long would an audit take?" I asked. "For a complete analysis?" 2 to 3 weeks, assuming Chester doesn't realize what we're doing. We'd need to access everything: bank records, credit card statements, client payments, expense accounts. "And if he finds out?" Margaret's expression grew grave. "If Chester is embezzling company funds or using business resources for personal gain, discovering our investigation could prompt him to accelerate whatever schemes he's running. He might try to move money offshore, destroy records, or claim financial assets before you can protect them." The implications were staggering. Not only was my marriage crumbling, but my father's company, the business I'd given everything to preserve and expand, might be under attack from within. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a legal pad. "The anonymous photographs. Someone went to considerable trouble and expense to document Chester's affair. Professional surveillance, quality prints, careful timing. This wasn't a casual observer with a cell phone." I hadn't considered that angle. "What are you suggesting?" "Either someone has a personal vendetta against Chester, or someone wants you to discover the affair for reasons of their own. Either way, you have an unknown ally or enemy who's watching your situation closely." As I drove home that evening, Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Someone was watching, documenting, gathering evidence. But why? What did they gain by exposing Chester's betrayal? And more importantly, what else did they know about my husband's activities that I hadn't discovered yet? That night, I lay in bed beside Chester, listening to his steady breathing and wondering how many lies he'd told me, how many times he'd looked into my eyes and promised loyalty while planning his next deception, how many company resources he'd diverted to fund his relationship with Victoria. The man sleeping peacefully beside me had become a stranger, one with access to everything I'd worked to build. And somewhere in the darkness, someone else was watching, waiting to see what I would do with the truth they'd handed me. I closed my eyes and began planning my next move, knowing that everything I'd believed about my life was about to change forever. The confrontation came on Friday evening. I'd spent 2 days wrestling with the photographs. 2 days watching Chester kiss me goodbye each morning while knowing he'd been kissing Victoria with the same lips. The charade had become unbearable. Chester was in our home office, reviewing contracts for a new commercial listing, when I walked in and placed the envelope on his desk. He looked up with that familiar smile, the one that had once made my heart flutter but now felt like a calculated performance. "What's this?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected. "Why don't you open it and tell me?" Chester's hands moved slowly as he pulled out the photographs. I watched his face carefully, cataloging every micro-expression as he saw himself with Victoria captured in vivid detail. Surprise, then calculation, then something that looked almost like relief. "Esther," he said finally, setting the photos aside. "I can explain. Can you?" I sat down across from him, amazed at how calm my voice sounded. "Because I'd love to hear how you explain charging your mistress's jewelry to our company credit card." Chester was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk between us. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It started as nothing. Victoria was helping with some legal research, and we'd grab lunch to discuss cases. I was lonely, Esther. You were always traveling for Wellington projects, always buried in architectural plans or conference calls with London. I felt like I was losing you to something bigger than our marriage." The words hurt, because they contained a grain of truth. I had been consumed with the Wellington partnership, working 18-hour days and traveling constantly. But that didn't justify what Chester had done. "So you decided to have an affair? It wasn't supposed to become that." Chester's eyes filled with what looked like genuine tears. Victoria was just there. She listened when I felt overwhelmed by running Maxwell & Associates. She understood the pressure of trying to live up to your father's legacy while supporting your new ambitions. And the jewelry? The hotel rooms? The lies about client meetings? Chester's shoulders sagged. It spiraled out of control. Victoria started expecting more. Expensive dinners, gifts, weekend getaways. I knew it was wrong, but I was in too deep to figure out how to stop without destroying everything. I stared at my husband, the man I'd trusted with my father's company, with my heart, with my future, and felt a complex mix of anger, grief, and pity. Chester looked genuinely tormented, caught between his guilt and his desire to salvage what remained of our life together. "Do you love her?" I asked. The question hung in the air for several heartbeats before Chester answered. "I thought I did. But sitting here now, looking at what I've thrown away." He reached across the desk for my hand. "Esther, you're my wife. You're the woman I chose to build a life with. Victoria was an escape, a fantasy. But you're real. We're real." Despite everything, I found myself wanting to believe him. 8 years of marriage doesn't disappear overnight, and the man pleading with me across our desk was the same person who'd held me through Dad's death, who'd celebrated every professional victory, who'd dreamed alongside me about building something extraordinary together. "What about the company money?" I asked. "I'll pay back every penny," Chester said immediately. "The jewelry, the hotels, all of it. I'll take out a personal loan if necessary. And I'll end things with Victoria completely. No more contact, no more meetings, nothing." "How do I know you mean it this time?" Chester stood and moved around the desk, kneeling beside my chair in a gesture that reminded me painfully of his proposal 5 years earlier. "Because I'm going to prove it to you. Every day, in every way I can. Esther, I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you for one anyway." The tears in his eyes looked genuine. The remorse in his voice felt real. And the alternative, divorce, dividing the company, starting over at 34, seemed overwhelming in that moment. "We'd need counseling," I said finally. "Real counseling, not just a few sessions to make me feel better." "Yes, whatever you want." And complete transparency. Passwords to your phone, your email, your calendar. No more secret meetings or mysterious expenses. Of course. And Victoria has to go. Not just from your life, but from Phoenix if possible. I won't spend the next decade wondering when I might run into her at business events. Chester nodded eagerly. I'll handle it. I'll make sure she understands that any contact between us is finished. Over the following weeks, Chester threw himself into the role of repentant husband with the same intensity he'd once applied to his legal practice. He scheduled couples counseling with Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a respected marriage therapist recommended by Margaret Chen. He gave me all his passwords and login information. He even arranged for a forensic accountant to review all company expenses from the past 6 months, identifying and calculating reimbursement for every personal charge. The total came to $47,000, a staggering amount that included not just jewelry and hotel rooms, but expensive dinners, weekend trips, and even a designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Chester took out a personal loan to repay the company within 2 weeks, transferring the funds with an accompanying letter of apology for his, quote, temporary lapse in judgment. In therapy sessions, Chester was the picture of contrition. He spoke eloquently about his feelings of inadequacy, his fear of being overshadowed by my success, and his genuine regret for handling those insecurities through betrayal rather than communication. I was proud of Esther's achievements, he told Dr. Hoffman during our 3rd session, but I was also intimidated by them. The Wellington partnership represented a level of success I'd never imagined reaching myself. Instead of seeing it as our victory, I started seeing it as evidence that I wasn't enough for her anymore. Dr. Hoffman nodded sympathetically. It's common for partners to feel threatened when one person experiences rapid professional growth. The key is learning to communicate those feelings rather than acting out through destructive behavior. Exactly, Chester agreed. I should have talked to Esther about my insecurities instead of seeking validation elsewhere. The sessions were emotionally exhausting but seemed productive. Chester appeared genuinely committed to understanding the root causes of his behavior and preventing future betrayals. He was attentive at home, romantic in ways he hadn't been for months, and completely transparent about his schedule and activities. For 6 weeks, I almost believed we were healing. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, when I returned early from a Desert Springs meeting to find Chester's office empty and Gigi acting strangely nervous. When I asked about Chester's whereabouts, she claimed he was at a property inspection that wasn't on his calendar. Something about her evasiveness triggered my suspicions. Instead of going to my own office, I drove to the property Gigi had mentioned, a commercial building we were listing in Tempe. Chester's car wasn't there. On impulse, I called the number from the anonymous photographs, the one printed on the back of one image. It went straight to voicemail, but the greeting made my blood run cold. You've reached Victoria Blackwood. I'm currently out of the country on business, but I'll return your call when I'm back in Phoenix next week. Out of the country. But according to Chester, Victoria had moved to Seattle permanently to avoid any chance encounters. According to Chester, their relationship was completely over. I sat in my car outside the empty commercial building, hands shaking as the truth hit me. The counseling sessions, the transparency, the passionate promises to change, it had all been performance. Chester had simply gotten better at hiding his deception. My phone rang, and Chester's name appeared on the screen. Hi, sweetheart, he said, his voice warm and familiar. Just finished the property inspection. The building looks great. I think we'll have multiple offers within a week. That's wonderful, I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. I can't wait to hear all about it. As I hung up and drove home to our house in Paradise Valley, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being the naive wife who wanted to believe in second chances. Chester had made his choice, and now I would make mine. Namesai too, the reconciliation was over. It was time for war. I became a detective in my own life, carefully documenting every lie while maintaining the facade of a trusting wife working to rebuild her marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Chester thought he was the master manipulator, but I was learning to play the game better than he ever had. The breakthrough came when I hired a private investigator named Alex Sterling. Alex was recommended by Margaret Chen as someone who specialized in corporate fraud and matrimonial cases, Exactly what I needed. He was a former FBI agent with the kind of methodical approach that could uncover secrets Chester never imagined anyone would find. I need to know everything, I told Alex during our first meeting at a coffee shop in Tempe, far from anywhere Chester might see us. The affair, yes, but also any financial irregularities, business dealings, anything that could affect my company or my assets. Alex reviewed the photographs I'd received and nodded approvingly. Whoever sent you these did professional quality surveillance work. They've given us a head start, but we need to dig deeper. Has your husband displayed any other suspicious behaviors? Changes in routine, new friendships, unexplained knowledge about things he shouldn't know? I thought back over the past months, patterns I'd dismissed starting to make sense. He's been incredibly interested in the technical details of my Wellington partnership, financial structures, international banking procedures, things that seemed like supportive curiosity at the time. We'll start with a comprehensive audit of all accounts he has access to, both personal and business. Then we'll expand the surveillance to document current activities. Alex pulled out a contract. Mrs. Davidson, I have to warn you, sometimes these investigations reveal things clients wish they hadn't discovered. Are you prepared for that possibility? I'm prepared for anything, I said, signing the papers. What I can't handle is living in a marriage built on lies. The first report arrived 3 days later, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Alex had uncovered a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond expensive jewelry for his mistress. Chester had been siphoning money from Maxwell and Associates for nearly 8 months, using a complex network of fake vendor payments and inflated expense reports. The total theft exceeded $200,000. But that wasn't the most damaging revelation. Alex had also discovered that Chester and Victoria were planning something much bigger than a simple affair. They'd incorporated a new company called Blackwood Development Services, positioning themselves to steal clients from Maxwell and Associates while using proprietary information about our properties and business relationships. They're planning a hostile takeover, Alex explained during our second meeting. Victoria has been using her legal expertise to identify weaknesses in your partnership agreements and corporate structure. Chester has been feeding her inside information about your clients, your projects, even your personal finances. I stared at the surveillance photos spread across the table. Chester and Victoria meeting with our biggest clients. Chester handing over files I recognized as confidential Maxwell and Associates documents. Victoria presenting what appeared to be competing proposals for properties we were already handling. How long have they been planning this? I asked. Based on the incorporation date of their company and the pattern of meetings, at least 4 months. Possibly longer. Alex pointed to a series of bank transfers. They've been moving money offshore, setting up accounts in the Cayman Islands. This isn't just an affair, Mrs. Davidson. This is a coordinated business theft designed to destroy your company while enriching themselves. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. While I'd been working 18-hour days to build Maxwell Wellington Development, Chester had been systematically dismantling the foundation of everything my father had built. Every client meeting he'd handled, every contract he'd reviewed, every financial decision he'd influenced, all of it had been calculated to benefit his secret partnership with Victoria. There's more, Alex continued, pulling out another folder. Victoria Blackwood isn't just a lawyer looking for career advancement. She's facing serious financial problems. Her previous firm is investigating her for embezzling client funds. She needs a major score to avoid potential criminal charges. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Victoria hadn't seduced Chester for love or even simple greed. She'd targeted him specifically because of his access to Maxwell and Associates resources and my Wellington partnership. Chester wasn't just cheating on our marriage. He was the perfect mark for a sophisticated con artist who needed to steal enough money to disappear before her own crimes caught up with her. That evening I sat through dinner with Chester, listening to him describe his day with the same charming enthusiasm he'd always shown. He told me about a new commercial listing, a potential client who was interested in Desert Springs retail space, and his excitement about a property inspection scheduled for the following week. Every word was a lie. The commercial listing was actually being handled by Blackwood Development Services. The potential client was someone Victoria had approached using information stolen from our files. And the property inspection was cover for another meeting with Victoria to plan their next moves against my company. "You seem quiet tonight," Chester observed, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Everything okay with the Wellington projects?" "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "George has been pushing hard on the Las Vegas expansion timeline." "You're working too hard," Chester said with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Maybe we should plan a vacation after the Desert Springs groundbreaking. Somewhere tropical, just the two of us." The suggestion would have been romantic 6 months ago. Now it felt like another manipulation, a way to get me out of Phoenix while Chester and Victoria accelerated their theft of my company. "That sounds wonderful," I lied. "Where were you thinking?" "The Bahamas, maybe. I heard about this amazing resort from a client. Private beaches, world-class spa, complete privacy." My blood chilled. The Bahamas. Alex's research had shown that Chester and Victoria had been researching property purchases in the Caribbean, specifically islands with limited extradition treaties. They weren't planning a romantic getaway for Chester and me. They were planning their escape route after they'd stolen everything they could from Maxwell and Associates. After dinner, I excused myself to call Margaret Chen with an update. Her reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Esther, you need to act quickly. If Chester realizes you're onto him, he could accelerate the timeline and drain your accounts before we can stop him. We need injunctions, asset freezes, criminal charges, everything we can throw at them." "How long do we have?" "Based on what Alex discovered, they're probably planning their move within the next few weeks. The Bahamas vacation suggestion is particularly concerning. That could be when they disappear with whatever they've managed to steal." I hung up with Margaret and stood in my kitchen, looking around at the home Chester and I had shared for 5 years. The granite countertops we'd picked out together, the wine rack filled with bottles from our anniversary trips, the photo wall documenting our life as a couple. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's marriage. Chester thought he was so clever, playing the role of devoted husband while systematically destroying everything I cared about. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. He saw the successful businesswoman who'd trusted him with her father's company. But he'd failed to recognize the fighter who'd built that success through determination and strategic thinking. As I prepared for bed that night, listening to Chester chat about his plans for tomorrow, more lies, undoubtedly, I finalized my own strategy. Chester and Victoria thought they were weeks away from their big score. They had no idea that their victims had become predators, and the trap was already closing around them. The war wasn't just beginning. It was about to end, and they were going to lose everything. The Phoenix Business Journal's annual Power Couples Gala was exactly the kind of event Chester loved. 500 of Arizona's most influential business leaders gathered at the Scottsdale Resort to network, celebrate success, and see and be seen. When the invitation arrived, Chester had immediately insisted we attend. "It's perfect timing," he'd said, straightening his tuxedo in our bedroom mirror. "With the Desert Springs groundbreaking next month and the Wellington partnership expanding, we need to maintain our visibility in the business community." I agreed wholeheartedly, though not for the reasons Chester imagined. The gala would provide the perfect stage for what I had planned. I had spent 2 weeks preparing for this evening, coordinating with Margaret Chen, Alex Sterling, and a team of federal investigators who'd become very interested in Victoria Blackwood's activities once we'd provided them with evidence of her embezzlement at her previous firm. Tonight would be the culmination of all our careful planning. I wore my most stunning dress, a midnight blue Vera Wang gown that had cost more than Chester's monthly salary, and carried a small beaded clutch that contained the most important documents of my life. Chester looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, playing the role of successful husband and business partner with his usual charm. "You look incredible," he said, kissing my cheek as we walked into the resort's grand ballroom. "Every man here is going to envy me tonight." If only he knew. The evening began exactly as these events always did: cocktails, networking, and the endless dance of business relationships that defined Phoenix's elite social scene. Chester worked the room like the skilled attorney he was, introducing me to potential clients and dropping subtle hints about his expanding role in the real estate development world. Esther's been busy with the international partnerships, he told Richard Sterling, president of Sterling Bank, but I've been handling more of the day-to-day operations at Maxwell & Associates, always looking for opportunities to expand our commercial lending relationships. The conversation was typical Chester, positioning himself as the accessible partner, while suggesting I was too busy with international work to focus on local business. I smiled and played along, knowing that in less than an hour everyone in this room would understand exactly who they'd been dealing with. Victoria arrived fashionably late, wearing a red gown that turned heads throughout the ballroom. She looked stunning, confident, every inch the successful attorney she pretended to be. When she spotted us across the room, she approached with the perfect blend of professional courtesy and personal warmth. "Chester, Esther, how wonderful to see you both," she said, air-kissing my cheeks with practiced elegance. "I hope you don't mind that I'm here. I'm representing Preston, Hartley & Associates tonight." "Of course not," I replied smoothly. "Though I thought you'd moved to Seattle permanently." Victoria's smile never wavered, but I caught the brief glance she exchanged with Chester. Plans change. I decided Phoenix offered too many opportunities to leave just yet. "How fortunate for us," I said, my tone perfectly neutral. As the evening progressed, I watched Chester and Victoria navigate the complex dance of appearing professional while maintaining their secret relationship. They were good at it, never standing too close together, never exchanging glances that lasted too long, never disappearing at the same time. But Alex's surveillance had taught me to recognize the subtle signals between them, the brief touches disguised as casual contact, the coded language that meant nothing to observers but everything to co-conspirators. At exactly 9:30 p.m., the MC called for attention as the evening's program began. Awards were presented to outstanding business leaders, recognition was given to major community contributors, and sponsors were acknowledged for their support of various charitable causes. "And now," the MC announced, "we have a special presentation from one of Phoenix's rising business leaders. Please welcome Esther Maxwell Davidson, CEO of Maxwell & Associates and Maxwell Wellington Development." Chester looked surprised as I made my way to the podium. We hadn't discussed my speaking at the event, and I could see confusion in his expression as I accepted the microphone. "Thank you so much," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "It's an honor to address so many respected colleagues and friends tonight." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience until I found Chester's face in the crowd. He was standing near the bar with Victoria, both of them watching me with polite attention. "Tonight, I want to talk about trust," I continued. "About the partnerships that form the backbone of our business community, and what happens when that trust is betrayed." A subtle shift rippled through the audience. This wasn't the typical congratulatory speech they'd been expecting. 6 months ago, I made a decision that seemed like a natural evolution of my business. I brought in a partner to help manage the day-to-day operations of my father's company, while I focused on international expansion. I chose someone I trusted completely, someone who I believed shared my values and my commitment to the legacy my father built. Chester's expression had shifted from confusion to concern. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out where this was heading. "What I discovered," I said, my voice gaining strength, "was that trust, once broken, reveals the true character of the people we choose to believe in." Margaret Chen appeared at the edge of the ballroom, flanked by 2 men in dark suits. Federal agents, though most of the audience probably assumed they were security or event staff. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share with you tonight a story about corporate theft, embezzlement, and the systematic destruction of a family business by people who were supposed to protect it." The ballroom had gone completely quiet now. Chester's face had gone pale, and I could see Victoria edging toward the exit. "For the past 8 months," I continued, "my business partner has been stealing money from Maxwell & Associates, over $200,000, to fund an extramarital affair and a competing business designed to destroy everything my father built." Gasps echoed throughout the room. I watched Chester's carefully constructed facade crumble as the reality of his situation became clear. "But the theft goes deeper than money. Confidential client information, proprietary business strategies, even details about my personal finances. All of it was shared with his accomplice, a woman who is currently under federal investigation for embezzling funds from her previous law firm. Victoria had stopped moving toward the exit. The federal agents were now positioned to intercept anyone trying to leave. Tonight, as we celebrate the honest partnerships that make our business community strong, I want to introduce you to Chester Davidson and Victoria Blackwood, the founders of Blackwood Development Services, a company built entirely on stolen assets and fraudulent business practices. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. I could see guests pulling out their phones, undoubtedly recording or texting about the dramatic scene unfolding before them. "I trusted my husband with my father's company," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "I trusted him with my heart, my future, and my family's legacy. In return, he chose to steal, lie, and cheat while hiding behind the facade of a loving marriage." Chester started moving toward the stage, his expression desperate. "Esther, stop. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied, pulling the documents from my clutch. "These are federal warrants for the arrest of Chester Davidson and Victoria Blackwood on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets." As if on cue, the federal agents moved through the crowd. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Chester and Victoria were approached by law enforcement in front of Phoenix's most powerful business leaders. I stood at the podium, watching my husband's arrest with a calm that surprised even me. This was justice, not just for the money he'd stolen or the trust he'd broken, but for every woman who'd ever been betrayed by someone they'd loved completely. The powerful couple who'd planned to steal my company and disappear to the Bahamas were now being led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed schemes exposed in the most public way possible. And I was finally free. Wara! The days following the gala arrests passed in a surreal blur of media attention, legal proceedings, and the systematic unraveling of the life I'd built with Chester. My phone rang constantly with reporters seeking comments about the Phoenix power couple scandal, while federal investigators continued uncovering new layers of Chester and Victoria's elaborate scheme. I sat in Margaret Chen's office 3 days after the arrests, reviewing documents that painted an even darker picture than I'd imagined. Chester's betrayal wasn't just recent. It had been calculated from the very beginning of our partnership. "The forensic accountants have traced the theft back to within 2 weeks of when you made Chester co-owner of Maxwell & Associates," Margaret explained, spreading bank records across her conference table. "He didn't betray you in a moment of weakness, Esther. He planned this from the moment you gave him access to your father's company." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every tender moment during our reconciliation, every therapy session where he'd claimed to understand his mistakes, every promise to rebuild our marriage, all of it had been performance while he accelerated his theft. "There's more," Margaret continued grimly. "Victoria Blackwood was never a legitimate attorney. Her credentials were fabricated, her previous firm never existed, and her real name is Victoria Patterson. She's wanted in 3 states for similar cons, targeting successful married businessmen." I stared at the mugshots spread before me. The same beautiful woman who'd charmed her way into Phoenix's legal community was actually a career criminal who specialized in seducing men with access to significant assets. "How many others?" I asked quietly. "At least 7 that we've identified. Always the same pattern. Target a successful married man with business assets, seduce him into betraying his spouse's trust, then steal everything possible before disappearing. Chester was just her latest mark." The irony was devastating. Chester thought he was the sophisticated manipulator having an affair with a brilliant attorney. In reality, he was the victim of a practiced con artist who'd played him as expertly as he'd played me. We'd both been marks in Victoria's elaborate game. "The good news," Margaret said, "is that her arrest has exposed a much larger criminal enterprise. The FBI is recovering millions in stolen assets from her previous victims. You're not just getting justice, you're helping other families who've been destroyed by her schemes." But justice felt hollow as I drove home to an empty house in Paradise Valley. Chester was in federal custody awaiting trial, his assets frozen, and his reputation destroyed. Victoria was being held without bail as a flight risk. Maxwell and Associates was safe from their theft, but I was alone in a way I'd never experienced. That evening, I walked through our house. My house now. Seeing the remnants of a marriage that had been built on lies. The kitchen where Chester had comforted me after Dad's death. The home office where he'd convinced me to make him my partner. The bedroom where he'd held me while planning my destruction. I found myself in Dad's old study. The room I'd preserved exactly as he'd left it. His leather chair, his law books, the photos of our family business through the decades. Sitting in his chair, I finally allowed myself to grieve. Not just for my marriage, but for the naive trust that had made Chester's betrayal possible. My phone buzzed with a text from George Wellington. Saw the news, flying to Phoenix tomorrow. We need to talk about protecting the international partnerships. The message reminded me that this scandal could destroy more than my personal life. Maxwell Wellington Development represented the future I'd dreamed of building. But would international partners want to work with someone whose judgment had been so catastrophically wrong? I poured myself a glass of Dad's favorite whiskey and sat in his chair, surrounded by the legacy he'd built through honest work and careful relationships. Chester had tried to steal this, to corrupt everything Dad had created, to use my love and trust as weapons against my own success. But he'd failed. Maxwell and Associates was stronger than ever, freed from the financial drain of his theft. The Wellington partnership was intact, built on my abilities rather than Chester's manipulation. And I was finally seeing clearly for the first time in months. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor who'd learned exactly how dangerous misplaced trust could be. Chester and Victoria thought they'd destroyed me by stealing my money and breaking my heart. Instead, they'd freed me to become something more powerful than they'd ever imagined. The real work began 2 weeks after the arrests, when I realized that destroying Chester and Victoria's scheme was only the beginning. They'd left behind a trail of financial damage that would take months to untangle, and their Bahamas escape plan revealed a level of sophistication that demanded a complete response. I assembled a team that would have impressed any Fortune 500 company. Margaret Chen leading the legal strategy, Alex Sterling coordinating with federal investigators, and a forensic accounting firm that specialized in international financial crimes. We called ourselves the Recovery Team, but I privately thought of us as the Justice Committee. The offshore accounts are the key, explained Jennifer Walsh, the lead forensic accountant, during our first strategy meeting. Chester and Victoria moved $780,000 to Cayman Islands banks over the past 6 months. That's not just Maxwell and Associates money. They were consolidating assets from other victims to fund their disappearance. The scope was staggering. They'd created an intricate web of shell companies, cryptocurrency transfers, and international wire transactions designed to make their stolen money untraceable. But they'd underestimated the determination of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. We need to think beyond criminal prosecution, Margaret added, spreading legal documents across my conference table. Civil asset forfeiture, international recovery treaties, even RICO statutes if we can prove this was an ongoing criminal enterprise. I studied the evidence we'd compiled, not just the obvious theft from my company, but a pattern of fraud that stretched back years. Victoria Patterson had perfected her system of targeting successful married businessmen, and Chester had provided the legal expertise to make their schemes more sophisticated than ever before. There's something else, Alex Sterling said, pulling out a new folder. The anonymous photographs that started this investigation? We traced them to Patricia Morrison, Robert Morrison's wife from Morrison's Jewelry. Apparently Victoria had been bragging about her expensive boyfriend to other customers, and Patricia got suspicious when she saw Chester paying for jewelry with a company credit card. The revelation was both touching and infuriating. A jewelry store owner's wife had shown more integrity than my own husband, taking the initiative to document evidence because she'd suspected something was wrong. Patricia Morrison had probably saved my company, and possibly my life. I want to make sure Patricia and her husband know how grateful I am, I said. Without her courage, Chester and Victoria might have succeeded. Over the following days, our investigation uncovered layer after layer of deception. Chester hadn't just stolen money. He'd been systematically documenting everything about my business relationships, my personal finances, even my daily routines. His home office contained detailed files about my meetings with George Wellington, architectural plans for Desert Springs, and financial projections for Maxwell Wellington Development that he had no legitimate reason to possess. Most disturbing was a timeline he'd created showing my travel schedule for the past year, with notes about when I'd be out of the country and unable to monitor company accounts. The Bahamas vacation he'd suggested wasn't random. It corresponded exactly with a major fund transfer Victoria had planned, timed for when I'd be unreachable on a remote island with limited communication. They were going to clean out everything while you were on vacation, Margaret realized, studying Chester's notes. By the time you returned to Phoenix, they'd have disappeared with every asset they could steal. The forensic team also discovered that Victoria had been conducting surveillance on me for months before she'd even met Chester. Photographs of me leaving my house, records of my daily routines, even details about my favorite restaurants and shopping habits. I hadn't just been betrayed by my husband. I'd been hunted by a professional criminal who'd studied me like prey. But the most valuable discovery was Chester's computer, which contained detailed communications with other victims of Victoria's schemes. He'd been coordinating with men in Chicago, Seattle, and Dallas who'd fallen for similar cons, sharing strategies for hiding stolen assets and comparing notes about their wives' vulnerabilities. This gives us everything we need for federal RICO charges, Margaret explained. Chester wasn't just Victoria's victim. He was an active participant in a criminal conspiracy that crossed state lines and involved multiple victims. As we prepared for the legal battles ahead, I felt a strange sense of clarity I hadn't experienced since Dad's death. For the first time in months, I knew exactly who I was fighting and why. Chester and Victoria had tried to destroy my life, but they'd actually revealed my true strength. I wasn't just recovering stolen money anymore. I was dismantling a criminal enterprise that had destroyed other families, and I was making sure that Chester and Victoria would face consequences for every crime they'd committed. The case we were building wouldn't just put them in prison, it would ensure they could never hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt me. 3 months after the arrests, Chester and Victoria made bail through a high-powered defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime. I wasn't surprised. Criminals with offshore accounts often had resources hidden from investigators. What did surprise me was the call I received from Chester 2 days later. "Esther, please don't hang up." His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confident charm I'd once found so attractive. "I know you have every right to hate me, but I need to see you. There are things about Victoria you don't understand." I almost laughed at the audacity. Chester, facing 20 years in federal prison, was still trying to manipulate me by positioning himself as a victim. But Margaret Chen had prepared me for this possibility. "Any communication with Chester should be documented," she'd advised. "If he's willing to provide evidence against Victoria, it could strengthen our case and help other victims. But never meet with him alone." "I'll meet with you," I told Chester, "but only with my attorney present, and everything will be recorded." We arranged to meet at Margaret's office the following Tuesday. Chester arrived looking like a shadow of his former self. Expensive suit replaced by rumpled khakis, designer watch gone, the cocky confidence that had once defined him completely absent. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact as Margaret set up recording equipment. "I know I have no right to ask for anything." "You're right," I replied coldly. "You don't. But I'm curious to hear what you think I don't understand about your partner in crime." Chester flinched at the words, quote, "partner in crime," then took a shaky breath. "Victoria threatened to kill you, Esther. When she realized you were investigating us, she started talking about making it look like an accident. A car crash on your way to a Desert Springs meeting, or maybe a fall at a construction site." The words hit like ice water. Margaret leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Do you have proof of these threats?" "Text messages, recordings, from when she didn't know I was listening. Victoria isn't just a con artist. She's killed before. Her real name is Victoria Patterson, and she murdered her husband in Texas 3 years ago, made it look like a heart attack." I felt the room spinning. The woman who'd charmed Phoenix's business community, who'd seduced my husband and stolen my money, was potentially a murderer, planning to eliminate me as a witness. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. "Because I'm not a killer," Chester said, finally meeting my eyes. "I'm a thief, a liar, a cheater, but I never wanted you dead." When Victoria started talking about permanent solutions to the Esther problem, I realized I was in over my head. Margaret was taking rapid notes. "Chester, if you're willing to testify about these threats and provide evidence of Victoria's other crimes, it could significantly reduce your sentence." "I know," Chester nodded. "My attorney explained the cooperation agreement. But Esther, you need to understand, Victoria is still planning something. Even from jail, she's been making calls, arranging meetings. She has people on the outside who owe her favors." The revelation sent chills through me. I'd thought the arrest had ended the threat, but Chester was suggesting Victoria's criminal network extended far beyond their simple theft scheme. "What kind of meetings?" Margaret asked. "I don't know specifics, but Victoria mentioned the Bahamas again yesterday during a phone call she thought was private. She said the plans were still in motion, just delayed." After Chester left, Margaret and I sat in her office, processing what we'd learned. Victoria Patterson wasn't just a sophisticated con artist. She was potentially a murderer with resources and connections I'd never imagined. "We need to contact the FBI immediately," Margaret said. "If Victoria is planning to harm you, witness protection might be necessary." But I had a different idea. Victoria thought I was a naive businesswoman who'd gotten lucky catching her schemes. She had no idea that her threats had been recorded, or that Chester was cooperating with federal investigators. "What if we gave Victoria exactly what she wants?" I suggested. "Let her think she has another chance to steal from me and disappear." Margaret looked skeptical. "Esther, that's incredibly dangerous." "Not if we control every aspect of the situation. Victoria's arrogance is her weakness. She can't resist the opportunity to humiliate me while stealing everything I have. We can use that against her." As we began planning an elaborate sting operation, I realized that Chester and Victoria had made one crucial error. They'd assumed that destroying my marriage and stealing my money would break me. Instead, they'd created someone far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Make Victoria believe she had one final opportunity to steal everything and disappear forever. We would dangle an irresistible target, a supposed emergency transfer of $2 million to cover construction costs for Desert Springs, while surrounding her with so much surveillance that every crime would be documented in real time. The setup began with a carefully orchestrated phone call. I contacted Gigi Patterson, Chester's former assistant who'd been cooperating with investigators since the arrests, and asked her to reach out to Victoria with insider information about my financial vulnerability. "Tell her I'm desperate," I instructed Gigi as FBI agents monitored the call. "The Wellington Partnership is demanding emergency funding for the Desert Springs project, and I need to transfer money quickly to avoid losing the deal. Make it sound like I'm panicking and making poor decisions." Gigi played her role perfectly, calling Victoria and breathlessly explaining that I was scrambling to move assets and would be personally handling a major wire transfer from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on Tuesday morning. Something about needing to sign documents during my layover to London. The location was crucial. Sky Harbor's Terminal 4 provided multiple exit routes, but was also completely controllable by federal agents. Every security camera, every communication channel, every possible escape route would be monitored and recorded. Victoria took the bait immediately. Within hours of Gigi's call, Victoria contacted Chester, not knowing that all his communications were being monitored, and insisted they needed to accelerate their timeline for the Bahamas plan. She'd obtained my flight information, learned about the wire transfer, and was already arranging for someone to intercept me at the airport. "She's planning to force you to transfer the money to her offshore accounts," Agent Sarah Kim explained during our final briefing. "Our surveillance suggests she has a male accomplice who'll approach you in the terminal, claim to be from airport security, and escort you to a private area where Victoria will be waiting." The irony was perfect. Victoria thought she was finally getting the chance to humiliate me personally while stealing my money. She had no idea that her perfect victim would be surrounded by a dozen federal agents and that every word she spoke would be recorded as evidence for her murder trial. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant Arizona sunshine that made everything seem possible. I dressed carefully, a navy business suit that projected competence and confidence, but not so expensive that it would make Victoria suspicious of my supposed financial desperation. At 8:30 a.m., I walked through Sky Harbor's Terminal 4, carrying a briefcase that contained what appeared to be wire transfer documents, but were actually arrest warrants for Victoria and her accomplice. Agent Kim's voice came through my nearly invisible earpiece as I approached the gate area. "Target identified. Victoria Patterson is positioned near the American Airlines check-in counter wearing a black suit and red scarf. Male accomplice, approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair, is approaching from your 3 o'clock. My heart raced as I saw him. A handsome man in his 30s wearing an airport security uniform that looked authentic but was actually a costume Victoria had arranged. He approached with the kind of official confidence designed to make people comply without question. "Mrs. Davidson?" he said, flashing a fake badge. "I'm Officer Rodriguez with Airport Security. We've had reports of suspicious activity around your gate. Would you mind coming with me to verify some information?" "Of course," I replied, allowing concern to creep into my voice. "Is everything all right?" "Just a precaution," he assured me, guiding me toward a corridor that led to administrative offices. "It should only take a few minutes." As we walked, I spotted Victoria waiting in a small conference room that she'd somehow gained access to. She looked stunning as always, perfectly styled red hair, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from successfully manipulating people for years. When she saw me, her smile was triumphant. "Esther," she said, as Officer Rodriguez closed the door behind us. "How lovely to see you again." "Victoria? What are you doing here? I thought you were..." "In jail?" Victoria laughed. "Bail is a wonderful thing when you have the right connections. Now let's discuss your little financial emergency. I understand you need to make a rather large wire transfer this morning." Her voice was smooth, professional, the same tone she'd used when seducing my husband. But there was something predatory in her eyes that I'd never noticed before. The look of someone who viewed other people as prey. "I don't understand," I said, clutching my briefcase closer. "How do you know about..." "Esther, please, don't insult my intelligence." Victoria's tone turned cold. "You're about to transfer $2 million to London, and I'm going to help you redirect that money to a much more practical destination. And if I refuse?" Victoria's smile turned deadly. "Let's just say that airports can be dangerous places. Accidents happen all the time." The threat was clear, and it was being recorded by multiple federal agents positioned throughout the terminal. Victoria Patterson had just confessed to planning my murder while attempting to commit robbery and extortion. In that moment, as Victoria reached for my briefcase with her perfectly manicured hands, I smiled for the first time in months. She thought she was about to steal my money and possibly kill me. Instead, she'd just destroyed herself completely. "Actually, Victoria," I said, opening my briefcase to reveal the arrest warrants, "I have something for you." The conference room door burst open before Victoria could process what she was seeing in my briefcase. Agent Kim entered first, followed by 4 additional federal agents, their weapons drawn and voices commanding immediate compliance. "Victoria Patterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, attempted robbery, and making terroristic threats," Agent Kim announced, as Victoria's face went from confident predator to shocked prey in seconds. "You have the right to remain silent." Victoria's accomplice, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Webb, a petty criminal with outstanding warrants in 3 states, tried to run but was tackled by agents positioned in the corridor. The fake security uniform that had been his disguise became evidence of their elaborate scheme. "This is impossible," Victoria sputtered as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "You can't prove anything. This was just a conversation between old friends." Actually, I said, standing as agents led her toward the door, we can prove everything. Every threat you made, every attempt to extort money, even your plans to make my death look like an accident. It's all recorded, Victoria. Along with evidence of your husband's murder in Texas and fraud schemes in 7 other states. The color drained from Victoria's face as the magnitude of her situation became clear. She'd walked into a trap so complete that there was no possibility of escape, no legal technicality that could save her, no manipulation that could work against evidence gathered by the FBI. You stupid bitch, she hissed as agents moved her through the terminal. You have no idea what you've done. There are people who won't let this. The people you're referring to have already been arrested. Agent Kim interrupted. We rolled up your entire network this morning. Your contacts in the Cayman Islands. Your money launderers in Miami. Even the corrupt officials who helped you disappear from Texas. It's over. As Victoria and Marcus were led away, I felt a profound sense of closure I hadn't experienced since finding those first photographs months ago. The woman who'd destroyed my marriage, stolen my money, and planned my murder was facing life in prison without possibility of parole. But the real victory came 2 hours later when I walked into the federal courthouse for Chester's sentencing hearing. His cooperation with the investigation had earned him a reduced sentence, 12 years instead of the 30 he'd originally faced. But it was still justice for the man who'd betrayed everything I'd trusted him with. Chester looked up as I entered the courtroom, his expression a mixture of shame and desperate hope. He'd testified against Victoria, provided evidence of her crimes, and written a lengthy confession detailing every aspect of their scheme. But none of that could undo the damage he'd inflicted on my life and my father's legacy. Esther, he whispered, as I took a seat behind the prosecutor's table. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I need you to know. It doesn't mean anything, I interrupted quietly. And it never will. The judge's sentence was swift and final. Chester Michael Davidson would spend the next 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which he could have no contact with me or my business interests. His law license was permanently revoked, his assets forfeited to pay restitution to his victims. As the marshals led Chester away, he looked back one final time. I met his gaze without emotion, feeling nothing for the man who'd once been my husband and business partner. That person had been a fiction, a carefully constructed performance designed to steal everything I cared about. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Maxwell & Associates, now Maxwell International, reflecting our expanded global partnerships, surrounded by the team that had helped me rebuild from Chester's betrayal. George Wellington had flown in from London to celebrate the official groundbreaking of Desert Springs, the first of 12 projects we'd planned across 3 countries. To Esther Maxwell, George said, raising his champagne flute as our staff applauded, a woman who turned devastating betrayal into unprecedented success. As I looked around the room at faces I trusted, Margaret Chen, Alex Sterling, Elsie Rodriguez, and the dedicated employees who'd remained loyal throughout the scandal, I realized that Chester and Victoria had failed in the most fundamental way possible. They'd tried to destroy me, but had instead revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. They'd stolen my money, but I'd built something bigger. They'd broken my heart, but I'd found a life that didn't depend on anyone else's loyalty. Most importantly, they'd tried to corrupt my father's legacy, but had instead inspired me to expand it beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The woman who'd been left stranded at that airport, metaphorically and literally, was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, smarter, and absolutely unafraid of whatever challenges lay ahead. Chester and Victoria were in prison where they belonged, and I was finally, completely free. 1 year later, I stood on the terrace of my new penthouse overlooking Camelback Mountain, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The view from here was spectacular, far better than anything Chester and I had shared in our Paradise Valley house, which I'd sold 6 months after his sentencing. Everything about my life was different now. Maxwell International had become one of the Southwest's most respected development firms, with projects spanning from Phoenix to London to Dubai. The Wellington partnership had evolved into something even more ambitious, a global network of sustainable luxury developments that were reshaping how people thought about urban living. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Morrison, the jewelry store owner's wife who'd started this entire journey by documenting Chester's affair. She'd become an unlikely friend, and we met monthly for coffee to discuss everything from business to books to the strange bonds formed by surviving betrayal. Saw the Forbes article about Maxwell International. Your father would be so proud, her message read. She was right. Dad's small real estate firm had become an international powerhouse. But more importantly, it remained true to the values he'd instilled: honesty, innovation, and genuine care for clients and employees. Chester had tried to corrupt those values, but had instead forced me to strengthen them. The envelope that had destroyed Chester and Victoria's lives sat framed on my office wall now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what I'd learned about trust, power, and the importance of fighting for what matters. The scared, betrayed woman who'd opened that envelope was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength comes from surviving your worst moments and refusing to let them define your future. At 35, I was wealthier, more successful, and infinitely happier than I'd ever been during my marriage. The loneliness I'd feared would consume me had been replaced by meaningful friendships, challenging work, and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting and important. Chester was scheduled for release in 11 years, assuming good behavior. Victoria would never see freedom again. Her murder conviction in Texas had added life without parole to her federal sentences. Sometimes I wondered if Chester ever thought about the life we'd planned together, but mostly I didn't think about him at all. The woman who'd been left stranded at that airport terminal, clutching evidence of her husband's betrayal, had discovered something Chester and Victoria never understood. Being abandoned by people who never truly loved you isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of the one you were always meant to write. As the Phoenix sun climbed higher into the desert sky, I smiled and went inside to begin another day of building the empire my father had dreamed of, one based on integrity, innovation, and the unshakable knowledge that I could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, I'd already survived the worst betrayal imaginable. Everything else was just business. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.